Well, as you know, India is the largest democracy in the world, and the Magna Carta has been the foundation of individual liberties, and which is at the core of democratic institutions and democratic constitutions around the world. So obviously, as the largest democracy in the world, we also draw inspiration from the original Magna Carta. The founding fathers of the Indian Constitution did draw on those same principles, and therefore it is important to a democracy like India.
The bedrock of the judiciary is access to justice. It is critical that we as a society are governed by rules and provide mechanisms whereby individual citizens can resolve their disputes, that's disputes between themselves or disputes with the state. And what the judges do is provide an independent, impartial solution to the problem. Now, not everybody will necessarily agree with the solution that we, the judges, reach. We reach it according to our understanding of the law. And a party who doesn't agree can usually appeal to a higher court. But what is absolutely critical is that we do have a solution that binds everybody. Otherwise, people will take the law into their own hands. And if we fail to provide appropriate mechanisms to resolve disputes, society as we know it and understand it would ultimately fracture.
Well, I think the average Indian may not be conscious of a direct link between the Magna Carta and the Constitution, but certainly all those who have been educated and are conscious of how the Constitution is developed are conscious and aware about the Magna Carta. The Indian Constitution framers who spent 2.5-3 years drawing up the Indian Constitution took models and inspiration from other democratic constitutions, and many of those, like the American Constitution, hark back directly to the principles which the Magna Carta initially brought into being.
Magna Carta is incredibly important to the United States. Obviously, when we formed our Constitution and formed our country, we used it as a reference point. And it's easy when you go and look at these beautiful, if you've seen one of the 4 originals, you can look at it and look at the words and look at the language and these old-fashioned seals, and you can look at it as really old. And you see phrases like feudal scutage, or talking about fish weirs in the Thames, and it can feel distant in time and distant in place. Except the real power of it, and what's amazing as we contemplate its role today in the United States, is that a piece of paper could stand up to a sovereign. Think about that. A piece of paper standing up to the power of a king. Or in today's language, a piece of paper standing up and limiting the power of the state, the power of government.
You know, with 1/6 or 1/7 of humanity all in that one country, India, it's extremely important to remember that they are governed under a democratic system. And the Indian Constitution guarantees certain fundamental rights and fundamental freedoms. It's there in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, which is sometimes referred to popularly as the Magna Carta of the freedoms of the Indian citizen, the liberties, the individual liberties. And they are laid down in a series of articles in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution. The right to freedom of religion, the right to freedom of association, the right to freedoms of all kinds. These are the fundamental rights laid down in the Indian Constitution. There are also stipulations in the Constitution as to remedies to ensure that you are able to access those rights and enjoy them in a system like ours. So I would say it's an extraordinary achievement, the Indian Constitution. We are in fact next month going to be celebrating its 65th anniversary. It's a unique document, the longest written constitution in the world, and the constitution of the largest and therefore the greatest democracy on earth. And certainly fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms are integral to that constitution.
So in our Constitution, we have what's called the Bill of Rights, which not everyone realizes they actually weren't part of the actual Constitution. They were the first 10 amendments, the first 10 additions to our Constitution. And if you focus just on the Fifth Amendment, which talks about the fact that you cannot be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law, that traces directly back to Chapter 39 of Magna Carta. So you see that connection there. But what's even more interesting, I think, is you not only have that connection back from our Fifth Amendment back to Chapter 39, but if you go forward in our country and you think about the evolution of justice and how we define it in the United States, we didn't stop with 10 amendments. We continued to change it. And we have 100 years roughly after our Constitution, we fought our Civil War, as you know. And in that, we have the 14th Amendment, which extends, and use those same words, life, liberty, property, but extending it even further, protecting individuals against the power of the states. So not just the federal government, but now you were protected against the state you lived in, abusing its power in those ways. So again, a piece of paper standing up to the power of government.
It's important to work for freedom and be respectful of the freedom of others, and to protect people, to allow them to express themselves again, as long as they're doing so within a positive context and not infringing upon the rights of others. So that's just part and parcel of being a citizen and being in favor of religious freedom.
So not only can students learn about it through the efforts of Library of Congress and the American Bar Association and all the great educational programs they're doing in the United States, but many, many American children come to Washington, D.C., and they will go and look at the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And what they may not know is that over its history, 100 cases that the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, has decided have referenced Magna Carta directly. So they may not know that, what goes on inside the Supreme Court, but if they look at outside the Supreme Court, the story that the people designing the Supreme Court decided to tell, they have these beautiful bronze doors that talk about the evolution of justice throughout history. And one of the scenes on that bronze door is King John sealing Magna Carta. So it's right there in our Supreme Court.
And for a document that contains so little by way of principle, it's got some 63, I think, depending on how you divide it, clauses. Only 3 or 4 still have any particular relevance in our own era, or in fact for most of the last 800 years. And those 3 or 4 are the ones which express some degree of principle. That document, a document agreed in those circumstances, is simply not the kind of document you'd expect people still to be referring to after 800 years. But it has retained its relevance because it became, through the course of those 800 years, a kind of symbol of the acceptance by those who held the power, in this case in England at the time and through the centuries that followed, the king or the queen above all, the acceptance of the powers that be, that they do not have the only or the last word even in the lives of their subjects. And because Magna Carta came to represent this in the Middle Ages and was therefore reissued by king after king, it was referred back to by later generations, as it still is to our own day, and not just within England where it comes from, but in many other countries around the world, as a phrase, a concept, not just this one passing document, but a concept of rights against power, the little people against the controlling power, and as a concept, as a guarantor of freedom and liberty and justice, it remains and will retain, I'm sure, in perpetuity, an extraordinary power.
So as we commemorate in 2015 800 years of Magna Carta, of course our country isn't that old, and so we talk a lot about our history and the founding of our country and the influence of Magna Carta on someone like John Adams, who was the first guy to have my job as the U.S. representative here in the UK. And when he went around America at the time of the formation of our Constitution, he always talked in praise of Magna Carta and encouraged states to look back to that as inspiration. But as much as we look back in history, I think it's also important that we reflect on its relevance today. Because if you look at our modern presidency, so in my lifetime, you've seen how the highest office in the land in our country has been called into and said that office is not above the law, and has been called in numerous instances. And so it's a good reminder, not only in our own country, but for other countries on the world, as they evolve on their democratic journey, that they, I think, would be well served to follow the United States example. We look to Magna Carta, and I think they can look to Magna Carta.
Magna Carta is important, enormously important, an iconic document for this reason. When you read it, it's a long document of 63 clauses, most of them very detailed, very obscure, most of them the product of the specific circumstances of England in the early 13th century. They have no resonance with us today. Only 4 clauses are still on the statute book, but those clauses are very important, and 2 of them affirm overarching principles of universal validity. And they're the 2 famous ones. Clause 39 in the original version, Clause 39, which says, "No free man shall be imprisoned or arrested or deprived of his lands without judgment of his peers or against the law of the land." And then with it, Clause 40, "To no one shall we sell, delay or deny right or justice." Now the significance of those clauses is this. Before Magna Carta, there was much debate about the relationship between the king and the law, for which we can read between executive authority and the law. One view was the king is above the law. He derives his authority to rule from God. He's answerable only to God. He's not answerable to his subjects. The other view was that the king is indeed below the law. He publishes the law, he enforces the law, he's bound by it himself. Those were the 2 rival viewpoints. Now, Magna Carta settled that argument once and for all. It said the king is under the law. The king is bound by the same law as everybody else. No matter how important you are still under the law. That is the principle which Magna Carta affirmed. That is the principle we are celebrating this year. Now, I'm not claiming that every king who followed accepted that or observed it according to the letter. Heavens, Magna Carta did not do very much to help all the victims of Henry VIII. It was a bumpy ride. But in the end, it triumphed. It finally triumphed in England in the second half of the 17th century, when the basic principles of Magna Carta were finally enshrined in the law. I'm thinking, for example, of the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. But the key thing is, it was in Magna Carta that that principle was first laid down and accepted by the king. The king is under the law. So why does Magna Carta still matter? Why are we celebrating it? It affirmed that principle. It's a beacon of freedom. It has enormous symbolic value. People all over the world look to Magna Carta as the place where the story begins, and to Runnymede where it all started.